Hello, and thank you so much, everyone, for your interest in the DNR's recent work on trade pathways for invasive species. Invasive species are non-native species that may cause harm to Minnesota's wildlife, plants, environment, recreation, or human health. And global trade drives invasive species introductions to the US and upper Midwest. So I'm really excited to talk with you about some of our efforts aimed at preventing introductions and learning more about these pathways for invasive species to come into the state. So just kind of an overview of the presentation today. I will give some brief background on kind of this issue of invasive species and trade, and then we'll talk about a couple of projects related to working with businesses. We did an in-store retail assessment at pet stores and seafood markets, and we also conducted a survey of live organism sellers. Then we'll talk a little bit about working with hobbyists and consumers, like some of you. We did a survey of aquarium and water garden hobbyists. And I'll talk a little bit about online sales, suppliers, and how these issues extend beyond Minnesota's borders. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some question and answer as well. So let's just start with some brief background on the issue of invasive species and trade. So the trades that we have been focusing on are those that rely on the movement and possession of live organisms. So these include the horticulture, pet, food, bait, and biological supply trades. So we want to do another quick poll to better understand who is joining us today. Jake is going to activate a poll asking which of the options provided on that poll there best describe you. So some of you might be aquarium enthusiasts, gardeners, anglers. Live seafood can be something that we are looking at. Teachers or students who have classroom pets and things like that. You might be one of those businesses that is involved in selling live organisms or something else. So you can use that poll to select the most appropriate response there. We'll give that maybe 15 seconds too. Like we have results are showing up in the chat there. A couple of aquarium enthusiasts, gardeners, a little bit of everything. So that's great to see. Anglers, folks who enjoy cooking with live seafood. So that's awesome. It's great to see kind of the diversity of folks here. And if you want to share more about, kind of other things, a lot of folks selected other. I'd be interested in, you can feel free to post that in the chat as well. So all of these trades provide important cultural, recreational, and economic benefits, but they have also historically led to invasive species introductions. Based on the agency and scientific literature that's out there, conversations with experts around the country working in this area, and some searching for invasive species online, we know that around 42 or 2/3 of Minnesota prohibited invasive species, those that are illegal to possess and sell, have been documented in these trades. Additionally, around 15 or 3/4 of Minnesota regulated invasive species have been documented in these trades. Regulated species can be thought of as kind of a watch list, but they are legal to sell in Minnesota. And around 15 or 3/4 of Minnesota of additional risky species. So these are unlisted species for which risk assessments have suggested likely harmful impacts to the Great Lakes region were also documented in these trades. Some additional issues are that release of species from these trades is not uncommon. There are some great outreach campaigns out there, but they're not always recognized by individuals in the industries or their customers. Species are often mislabeled or unlabeled. We don't know what the supply chains look like. A better understanding of this would help us address risky practices and points in the process of moving organisms from one entity to another. You can buy a lot of invasive species online, and authorities for inspections and enforcement are somewhat limited in some of these trades. Before I go any further, I want to talk about how you can help and what I mean when I talk about being a responsible buyer. I'm guessing most of you are going to think that these suggested behaviors are obvious and already take these actions. And you'll see later in the presentation that our surveys showed this too. As a responsible buyer, you can help prevent invasive species introductions by practicing the following behaviors and spreading the word about them. So first, never release non-native animals or plants into the environment outside of residential and commercial landscape settings. Choose low risk or native species when making purchases. Dispose of unwanted bait in the trash and unwanted aquatic plants in the trash or compost. And if you need to rehome a pet that you can no longer care for, contact a local pet store, vet, or hobbyist club for rehoming options. And you can also join our DNR Responsible Buyers email list. You can join this by searching online for Responsible Buyers Minnesota DNR and entering your email address where it says sign up for updates. So I'll also show a link to this page where you can sign up at the end of the presentation here. Now I want to quickly just list some of the more significant Trade Pathways projects we've worked on in the past few years to give an understanding of just kind of the breadth of work that has been done. In 2019, we hosted a workshop with representatives primarily of the aquarium and water garden industries in Minnesota to start to understand their perspectives. In 2020, we conducted a survey of Minnesota sellers across most of the trades. Last year, we hired a contractor to visit pet stores and seafood markets to both examine their stocks for invasive species and provide education. And we also conducted a survey of aquarium and water garden hobbyists. A few additional efforts were work on online sales and outreach to online sellers, a symposium on enforcement of invasive species in trade, assisting with some local bait outreach projects, a community asset mapping project to better understand the resources and capacity around the state, outreach to fair organizers about issues related to distributing pets as prizes in carnival games, development of online and print resources. If you haven't seen these, I recommend checking them out. You can just search for Trade Pathways Minnesota DNR. And we conducted significant outreach about issues and permitting related to the use of prohibited invasive crayfish and crayfish boils. So if you see an event or an advertisement for an event where folks are planning to use live Louisiana crayfish, please let us know about that. These crayfish are causing serious problems in Michigan and have caused problems in Wisconsin. And they would likely be very difficult, if not impossible, to remove if they were to become established in a Minnesota lake. And there are reasonable alternatives for folks wanting to host crayfish boils. So this is something we've been working on too. First, I'll give an overview of the projects that most relate to working with businesses. The photo on this slide is from that workshop we held back in 2019. Participants included 13 individuals, primarily pet and water garden industry representatives and hobbyist societies. So there were some interesting takeaways from this workshop that I'll mention. We also conducted a survey of businesses involving live organisms, which I'll refer to as the seller survey. We did a direct mailing to more than 3,500 businesses as part of this, and some gains just from doing that beyond the survey itself were that they helped us educate businesses about invasive species regulations, let them know of our new website content, and invited them to join an email list so we have a better way to stay in contact with them. The survey was completed by horticultural, bait, pet, and food businesses. You'll see that we had some small sample sizes in some cases, and I wanted to note this, but I also think it's okay because we, kind of see this as a starting point and had not a great sense of these businesses' awareness and concern about invasive species prior to doing this. Another thing to note is that many of the aquarium retailers in Minnesota are big box chain stores, so we need to work with the corporate offices for those. So again, I see this as a starting point for Minnesota in all of these trades. I also want to note that with the food businesses, it's very difficult to know which businesses are selling live organisms. So we need to do some more targeted outreach there as well. And the last thing I'll say about this is that even within each one of these trades, you see that respondents were really diverse. So in the future, it would be great to be able to provide information specific to each one of these groups. So now I will dig into some of the results. And the findings I'll present here are primarily from the seller survey, but I will add in some related things we've learned from the industry workshop and the in-store retail assessment. First, we asked some basic questions about attitudes related to invasive species and their management. From top to bottom here, we asked about their level of agreement with the statements, "I'm concerned about invasive species in Minnesota," "Preventing the spread of invasive species is the right thing to do," and "It is my responsibility to ensure that my business does not contribute to the introduction and spread of invasive species." So generally, we see that most sellers are concerned about and take responsibility regarding invasive species. We did have a subset within each trade that disagreed, so we need to be conscious of these differences in opinion and try to meet folks where they're at. From the industry workshop, there was a feeling that a lot more work is needed and that enforcement is not strict enough. Some participants actually recommended to increase inspections and enforcement. And in the retail assessment, our contractor found that pet store staff are generally positive and knowledgeable. So one potential source of bias, and this goes for both surveys I'll be talking about today, is that folks are reporting to the DNR, so they might not be as likely to report if they disagree with some of these things. We also asked whether or not sellers are providing invasive species educational materials to their customers, and if they would be willing to provide educational materials if they were given to them for free. But the majority of sellers are not currently providing educational materials, and the retail assessment showed this too. However, it's encouraging that most businesses would be willing to distribute educational materials in the future. Many respondents in the survey also reported that they do remind customers not to release live organisms, even if they aren't handing out physical educational materials. We asked sellers to rank specific resources and initiatives based on their likelihood of helping them, other businesses, and/or their customers prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species. So the pattern that you see here generally held across the trades. Of the resources and initiatives we suggested, the ones that were seen by respondents as most helpful were an invasive species identification and best practices guidebook for employees, educational materials for customers, generally saying not to release invasive species, and online training for employees. The idea of a voluntary training and recognition program for businesses, for example, where businesses could publicize completion of invasive species prevention training in their marketing efforts, could also be a useful addition. And regulatory enforcement was something we wanted to include here because it was something that industry representatives called for in the workshop we hosted. However, it wasn't surprising, to see some concern with this come up in some of the survey comments. But all in all, the responses to this question will be particularly helpful in guiding future work. And we're interested in your thoughts on next steps here as well. So now I'll talk about our in-store retail assessment. For this project, we hired a consultant for Fortin Consulting to visit Minnesota aquarium retailers and seafood markets and examine stocks for invasive species. They also spoke with and educated store staff. Fortin visited nearly all known aquarium and live seafood markets in Minnesota. I want to note that Hennepin County pet stores were visited as part of a separate project funded by Hennepin County's Aquatic Invasive Species Program. I will primarily be reporting on findings from the DNR project, but in general, the findings were similar. Before I dig into the results, we have another poll question for you here. This one's kind of fun. We'll see if you can guess what we found in this retail assessment. So what type of prohibited invasive species was found in our retail assessment? And you can select either plants, snails, crayfish, or fish. Awesome. Results are coming in hot here. So it looks like most people thought plants. Second up were crayfish and snails. So let's find out. The prohibited invasive red swamp or Louisiana crayfish was found at 2 pet stores as part of our project. In speaking with the sellers and identifying species as part of this project, it became clear that crayfish identification is a real challenge for sellers. Even experts need to use a microscope and look at tiny structures to confidently identify crayfish to species. And coloration is not a reliable identifying feature. We actually had an expert crayfish taxonomist at Michigan State University assist with crayfish identification. There was also evidence of other prohibited species being sold. A few stores had signs on their tanks indicating that they sold some prohibited invasive species like the weather loach and Louisiana crayfish, but the species itself was not present at the time of the store visits. And this occurred at both the pet stores and seafood markets. Some of the seafood markets also advertised what looked like Louisiana crayfish on their websites, but they, again, were not observed by Fortin Consulting staff during their visits. I'll also note here that there was a language barrier at some of the seafood markets, so more work is needed to be able to provide education there. All 57 pet stores visited carried either regulated or prohibited invasive species. Commonly sold regulated invasive species included goldfish, koi, Brazilian waterweed, non-native water lilies, and red-eared slider turtles. All of those were found at more than 40% of the stores. They also observed sale of Carolina fanwort, parrot's feather, water hyacinth, water lettuce, and rusty crayfish. Hitchhiker crayfish, snails, duckweeds, and common salvinia were observed in 18 pet stores. Even more stores reported that they often receive hitchhikers that arrive unexpectedly in their shipments. One store manager said they once had a single order that had as many as 60 tiny crayfish in it. The stores reported that they manage these hitchhikers in different ways, like freezing and disposal, or giving them away to customers or employees. And hitchhiking of organisms is a known issue that has been documented in past research. Lastly, many species are sold and scientific names often are not used. Fortin Consulting documented over 500 varieties of just fish in their trips to pet stores. We know there are a lot of species in the trades, and we don't have the capacity to conduct risk assessments for every species. The scientific names are often not used as well. There are many, many common names for some of these species, which can make it difficult to detect them and difficult for suppliers and retailers to know what they're getting and selling. So these are some of the key findings from the retail assessment. These findings are largely consistent with past research. So the value of this was really to make contact with and educate sellers and gain a basic understanding of what's currently out there in Minnesota shops. It's important to remember that this represents only a snapshot in time, and further work would be needed to really represent the availability of invasive species in these and other trades in Minnesota. So what were some of the main recommendations that came out of the industry workshop? the seller survey, and the retail assessment. Keep working with industry to better understand how we can help them in invasive species prevention efforts. Provide periodic education to stores, including with direct contact. And for the seafood markets, we would need to determine languages being spoken and develop materials in those languages. Support industry in providing educational materials to customers, for example, by providing materials that they can distribute. Improve educational materials, for example, further developing our website to include nice photos of the invasive species in these trades to watch out for. And improve communications about best practices for disposal and provide options for disposal or rehoming. We have done some of this, but could do more. Sorry about that. So educate and collaborate with other invasive species professionals. The retail assessment suggested partnering more with local level partners, creating a reward for sellers who do the right thing. An example of this could be the training and recognition program we talked about. And conducting periodic inspections. Fortin Consulting did some store revisits and revealed high species turnover at the pet stores and seafood markets. And lastly, simplifying state invasive species regulations and work with other states to consolidate lists of regulations. So now we'll shift to talking about buyers, hobbyists and consumers like you, and what we know about buyers' perspectives on invasive species. We conducted a survey of aquarium and water garden hobbyists this past summer. A total of 479 respondents completed that survey. Hopefully that included some of you attending today. The survey was distributed through the DNR's communications channels, hobbyist groups like the Minnesota Aquarium Society and Minnesota Water Garden Society, and University of Minnesota Extension programs. The distribution in this way introduces another potential source of bias, as these folks may be disproportionately aware of and concerned about invasive species. So we also worked with pet and garden stores in the Twin Cities area to get the word out. Many retailers helped to distribute flyers advertising this survey, and hopefully that helped to capture our average aquarium and water garden owners. So yeah, we'll jump into the results from this hobbyist survey. Similar to the business survey, we asked if they knew what invasive species are, that aquarium and pond species can harbor hitchhikers that can potentially be invasive, then some species in these trades are invasive, and about the regulations prohibiting release, possession, and sale. You see here that we saw pretty high levels of awareness across the board for these questions. We also asked about their attitudes. More than 90% agreed with the statement, "I'm concerned about invasive species in Minnesota, that preventing invasive species is the right thing to do, and that aquarium and pond species should never be released into the wild." Just over 80% indicated that they were interested in learning more about how they can help prevent the spread. So this is really encouraging. But despite this generally high understanding of the basics of invasive species regulations, only about a third of respondents knew which species are illegal to possess and sell in Minnesota. And many reported they felt they didn't have or didn't know if they had the information they needed to avoid the purchase of invasive species. So this suggests we have a lot of work to do to help educate hobbyists about which species are prohibited and those that present risk of invasion. Some of the most trusted sources for species included independent pet stores and hobbyist clubs. When looking at where they had acquired their pond and aquarium plants and animals, aquarists most often selected independent pet stores, big chains, other hobbyists online from companies, and hobby clubs and auctions. Water gardeners most often selected gardening stores, hobby clubs and auctions, independent pet stores, online, and natural appearances. I think it's important to note that roughly a quarter of respondents reported purchasing their plants or animals online. where many prohibited invasive plants and animals are sold. A couple of important hobbyist practices we asked about were what species they've had in their aquariums and ponds. For aquarists, around 20% have had crayfish and have had turtles. Around 70% have had snails. For water gardeners, around 11% have had crayfish, though we suspect that many of these in ponds are native crayfish that moved in naturally. And I highlight this because all these are groups that have invasive species of concern within them. Disposal in the trash and composting are the most common methods of disposal for plants hobbyists no longer want or can no longer care for, followed by sharing or trading with other hobbyists. More than half of hobbyists check for hitchhikers, and half quarantine new plants and animals before putting them into their aquariums or ponds. So to me, this again shows that hitchhikers are very common, to the point where it's common practice for hobbyists to check for them. It would be great to be able to work with suppliers to reduce the prevalence of hitchhikers altogether. And lastly, around 21% of water gardeners reported having ponds near other water bodies. Thankfully, though, very few reported flooding where they have their ponds. We asked aquarium and pond owners what they would do with animals they were no longer able or willing to keep. So this is a sensitive topic. However, most pond and aquarium owners said they would be willing to euthanize animals and would be more likely to do this than release them into the environment. We also asked if hobbyists would go to great lengths to find an alternative to humanely euthanizing them or releasing them into the environment. We wanted to ask this question because sometimes these are the only two options we have for folks when it's not easy to share or trade with others. So you'll see there was greater uncertainty and disagreement in response to this question. Aquarium and pond hobbyists are willing to make commitments to preventing the spread of invasive species. Behavioral psychology research finds that people who commit to taking action are more likely to follow through on a behavior than if they had not committed to it. So survey respondents were shown one of the two example pledge forms here and asked if they would be willing to complete the form. Around 70% said they would be willing to complete the form on the left, and around 78% said they'd be willing to complete the form on the right. Hobbyists are willing to buy similar low-risk alternatives to invasive animals and plants. Around 88% said they'd be willing to purchase an alternative species. Some of our projects recommended developing a program similar to British Columbia's Grow Me Instead program that educates customers about invasive species and provides them with non-invasive alternatives. So this here is the logo for that program. And many hobbyists would be more likely to buy from a seller that had proof of participation in a statewide invasive species prevention training and recognition program. This goes along with that business survey and the idea that had been suggested to create a reward for businesses participating in invasive species prevention and education. So some recommendations for working with hobbyists that came out of all this were continue outreach to hobbyists, keep working with hobbyist groups and retailers, gather commitments, provide information on rehoming and euthanasia, use marketing to increase demand or to decrease demand for invasive species and increase demand for other species, similar to that Grow Me Instead program. Equip our watercraft inspectors with information on ponds and aquariums. Around 30% of hobbyists listed fishing piers and boat launches as places they would like to receive information. Improve our existing educational materials, again, especially that website content, having an online resource with photos and possibly low-risk alternative species. Providing those rehoming options, that idea to create a list of rehoming organizations and make pet stores aware of rehoming organizations and events, and establish a training and recognition program with branded materials. To round out the presentation, we can't talk about trade pathways for invasive species if we don't talk about online sales and the fact that these issues extend across states and beyond. We're dealing with a piece of the global wildlife trade when discussing this. Many invasive species are sold online, and there are some efforts that are starting to work toward addressing this. The Great Lakes Detector of Invasive Aquatics and Trade, or the Gladiator Project, aimed at reducing the availability of invasive species online. The project was led by the Great Lakes Commission and used an automated web crawler software to search the internet for a list of high priority invasive species. And then representatives of states' natural resource agencies contacted those sellers identified by that web crawler to educate them about invasive species regulations and ask them to either stop selling that species or put a notice on their sale page and have shipping restrictions to the states where those species are prohibited. Unfortunately, many of the contacted sellers did not respond to the outreach. There may be a need to have additional authorities or enforcement in this area. But that said, this project provided a reasonable means for identifying these sellers, which I feel is critical for invasive species prevention and just being able to have those connections and provide education. There's also an opportunity to partner with some of the major online marketplace sites like Amazon or eBay. And we have to remember that we're dealing with suppliers that distribute across multiple states in many cases. So partnerships across states and agencies are really important. This became even more apparent when zebra mussels were found contaminating aquarium mossballs last year. Multiple agencies regulate and inspect for invasive species at the national level. And the national response that occurred following this mossball discovery seemed to work pretty well. There was a coordinated response by national level agencies, the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council, and others to remove the mothballs from stores and notify customers. It was a little bit complicated because aquatic plant imports are inspected by USDA APHIS for regulated pests and pathogens of plants, while Fish and Wildlife Service is the primary regulator for wildlife imports and injurious wildlife like zebra mussels. But many partners rapidly helped to develop disposal guidelines. States, federal enforcement, and others like Minnesota Sea Grant contacted individual stores. I know university researchers did some outreach as well, and sellers responded. Etsy, eBay, and Amazon removed resale ads. PetSmart and Petco removed the mothballs from their stores. And in the retail assessment, it appeared that the direct outreach to stores did lead them to remove the mothballs. So it was a big concern, but also a successful collaborative response. That said, I suspect there is room for improvement and increased capacity to respond to similar scenarios in the future. For example, often imported products have very little very basic labeling requirements that do not provide enough information for tracking movement of particular species. So to wrap up, I'll just say I think there's so much we have to learn still with regard to the risks associated with these trade pathways and how to best address them, including more to learn from you all. Most of our findings are consistent with past research, but kind of give a present day look at Minnesota in particular. So these issues have been around for a long time, and I hope we can continue to develop partnerships with Minnesotans like you, as well as with businesses. Before we move on to your questions, I want to acknowledge the many individuals who supported this work, especially the businesses and hobbyists who participated in our workshop and surveys, including the Minnesota Aquarium Society, the Minnesota Water Garden Society, Twin Cities Area Pond and Aquarium retailers who helped get the word out about the survey, Carolyn Dindorf and her team at Orton Consulting, Ken and Kat Donnelly, who worked with us on our hobbyist survey and other projects, the DNR Invasive Species Program, especially Tina Fitzgerald, Erica Jensen, who led that Gladiator project, Doug Jensen, who's been a great partner with Minnesota Sea Grant throughout all of this, and many others. And this work was funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and State Interstate Invasive Species Plan implementation funding administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.